So I'm Daniel Ziblatt, Director of the Center for European Studies, and this is one of my favorite days of the year of being director to host this event, the Guido Goldman Lecture. This is the 5th annual Guido Goldman Lecture to honor the contributions of Guido Goldman. We have his biography here up front to promote the study of Germany and transatlantic relations at Harvard and the United States. It's been a bit over 4 years since Guido Goldman passed it away. Today we celebrate his legacy. He was, along with Stanley Hoffman, one of the founders of the Center for European Studies, and he served as director. He was a transatlantic statesman. He energetically built many institutions, including this institution, but also the German Marshall Fund. I like to tell this story that when I first arrived at Harvard, I think within the first week or two, he took me out to dinner, and I felt I immediately became his best friend, and I think he kind of had that effect on people. So he was a dynamo, of course, of energy and conversation. And I sometimes, every time I come in this building and walk around the building, I think of Stanley Hoffman, the longtime director and founder, as well as Guido, and think of, what would they make of the moment we're in? I don't really know the answer to that question, but I do know that Guido, as well as Stanley, would be very interested to hear what our speaker today has to say. Because I think both Guido understood the challenges facing democracies today, and that's what I think we will hear about. Today's speaker, Stefan Mau, is here to deliver the 5th annual Guido Goldman Lecture, someone who I think is perfectly situated to try to begin to help us understand the moment that we're in. Professor Mau is professor of macrosociology at the Department of Social Sciences at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and he's undoubtedly one of Germany's leading sociologists. His work takes us to the heart of many of the challenges facing democracies around the world, but with a big focus on Germany. He studies societies and transformations. He studies ruptures and how people react to those ruptures. And I think he always does this from a particular angle, which is in a sense from the bottom up. He helps us understand how the world looks to people who are facing ruptures, who are facing transformations. And I think the more we understand that, the better off we will all be. So he's the author of many, many books, too many to list right now, many important academic works of sociology, including The Moral Economy of the Welfare State, which I think was your first book, I believe. But more recently, I would draw your attention to a series of works that have made it onto the bestseller list in Germany and have also made Professor Mau into really an important voice in debates in Germany today. In 2019, he published a kind of personal book, Lutenklein, which is a profile of the community in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern in East Germany, where Professor Mau grew up in the 1970s. So it's a book that gives a kind of very personal sort of perspective and the story of a small community in Eastern Germany and how it's faced transformations. It hasn't been translated into English, I don't think, but it certainly should be.
Only into French.
Yes, so. Okay. He's also the author of a book on a different topic, The Sorting Machines, the Reinvention of Borders in the 21st Century, which takes as its premise that with globalization, this doesn't mean that borders disappear in significance. In fact, quite the opposite. And that borders serve as a kind of sorting machine. So it's an account of the persistence of borders in an age of globalization. In 2024, he published Triggerpunkte, so trigger points right here, Consensus and Conflict in Contemporary Society, from which he'll be speaking today. So I won't preview too much of that. And then most recently, this book, Ungleich vereint, so unequally unified, why East Germans are still different, I guess is the subtitle. So again, another Spiegel bestseller that also gives us a sense of what life is like in East Germany. So the point I want to communicate, and you'll hear from him in a moment here, is that this is somebody who really helps us understand the challenges that societies face as they undergo these deep transformations, and I think we really have a lot to learn. So two final points I just need to include in the bio. One, that Professor Mau was here in 2017, 2018 as a fellow at the Center for European Studies, so it's great to welcome you back. And just another important point of recognition is that Professor Mau was the recipient of the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize, which is one of the major prizes in Germany, multi-year, very, very important fellowship that's helped his research over the last several years. So it's really great to have you here and welcome you.
Thank you, Daniel, and also thank you to the CAS for inviting me and for this honor to talk here at the Goldman lecture, or to give the Goldman lecture. I mean, we live in turbulent times, and for social scientists, it's very difficult to catch up with what happens every day. And when I watch the news now and different new things coming out of the Oval Office, I feel that Germany is extremely boring these days. So I hope I can keep your attention during my talk. But at the same time, things also change in Germany. Just an hour ago, the German Chancellor Scholz announced a kind of Zeitenwende 2.0. Meaning that so we have to take care for our own security. The global situation changes. The US is retreating. There's a different situation with regard to Ukraine. The debt brake has to be reformed, or if not abolished. And he wants to call out for a state of emergency to have more spending on defense and military. So I probably cannot talk about all that, but you easily will understand that things shift rapidly, and what I tell you today might not be valid tomorrow anymore. I embed my talk a little bit into the current situation in Germany, and we have an upcoming election in 9 days, so I think, or 10 days. February 23rd, we will have an election after the break of the so-called traffic light or Ampel coalition last November or December. And that is a very difficult time for Germany because we have a very stagnant economy. We have negative growth for 3 years now. We have numerous geopolitical shifts which we have to deal with. And the German business model is coming under pressure. What is that business model? So you get cheap energy, cheap gas and oil from Russia. You get security and protection from the United States. And you have a market in China. All these three pillars of German strength are basically dissolving or crumbling. And so Germany has to reinvent itself, but it has no real idea how to do that. So if you look at the different programs and the election campaign, you will realize that there's really a lack of what I could call programmatic intelligence. So people did not really put a lot of effort into positioning themselves in this kind of new geopolitical context. What we do most of the time, we talk about migration issue, though Germany has a large deficit of human skill and of people engaging in labor. But at the same time, we always talk about migration as a threat to society. And just 2 weeks ago, we had a very important discussion in the German Bundestag. So for the first time, the Christian Democratic Party voted with the right-wing AfD, the first time in German history, on migration bills and tough on migration measures. And so there was a very large debate. And what the pictures you see here on top, this is a leadership of the AfD in the German Bundestag. And they are extremely happy that they broke through the so-called firewall between the far right and the democratic parties. And at the bottom, you have a picture of a demonstration in Berlin that happened immediately afterwards. So last Sunday, we had around 1 million people on the streets. In Munich alone, 260,000 people demonstrating against the breakdown of the so-called firewall and against any type of cooperation with the far-right AfD. So there's a fierce political conflict around the issue of migration, but also around the issue of how to deal with the far right. And we have a neighboring country, Austria, where we could see that the lack of consensus among the Democratic Party may lead to a relative strength of the far right. Even now, I think the discussions have ended, at least for the time being in Austria, but it was very likely, or still is likely, that we have a chancellor coming from the FPÖ. In the German situation, I think we have a development towards more political fragmentation. We have more political actors, more political parties that are relevant, and more political parties may enter the parliament after the next election. So these are the current figures of all the different polls, and you see the CDU will come out as the strongest party, around 30 or 29%. The AfD has doubled since 2021, since the last election, now around 21, maybe even 22%. The SPD had 25% last election, now they are down to 16 or even 15%. The Green Party is more or less the same as 2021. And we have three smaller political actors. We have in Germany a so-called 5% hurdle or threshold. And if you have less share of votes, then you will not become member of the parliament. So this is a lesson learned from the Weimar Republic, that you do not want to have fragmentation. But still, I mean, we might have 7 or even 8 parties in the German parliament, and that will be very difficult for forming a government. If we have that many parties, it's very unlikely that you can have a government of 2 coalition partners. You most likely will need 3, and that gets very difficult. There's a new actor here, that's the BSW, so Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, so a party that is more conservative in terms of culture and migration, but also still somehow redistributive in terms of economic policies. We have the Left Party, so the BSW is basically an offspring of the Left Party, but a party that is simply represented by one major figure, namely Sarah Wagenknecht. I'm now talking a little bit about this book, Trigger Points. As Daniel said, it came out a bit more than a year ago, and it caused some discussion in the German public because of the picture we have of ourselves as a highly divided society. So if you use the full corpus of German newspapers since the 1950s, and you look how often the terms polarization or being polarized or societal division come up, then you see it's increasing over time. More and more often people talk about polarization. When they talk about the German society, it's more or less common knowledge that we are extremely polarized, that it's more difficult to find common ground, that people become more hostile towards each other. And there's also a large social science or political science literature on cleavages dating back to the 1960s with Stein-Rockhahn and Lipset, who have worked on structural divisions within society and the way they are represented in the political context. And the idea is here that you have a trias of social structure, so a kind of segmentation of society in relation to being working class or being an employer, in relation to center periphery structures, or in relation to religious affiliation. And these are basically stable over time. And at the same time, you have related to that kind of social structure, a kind of consciousness, identity, a kind of culture, and a political representation. So there should be a kind of grounding of political conflict within social structure. And since 20 years or so, the cleavage theory was revitalized by very good research, I think, mainly looking at party systems and electorates. And the claim here is that we do not have a central distinction between labor and capital, so a kind of conflict that was very prominent for the industrial society, but that we have a new, more or less cultural or social-cultural conflict lines about cultural liberalization, about migration, open borders, or not. And so when observing the Western European party system, you see that there are new parties emerging. On the one hand, parties which are more liberal in cultural terms, and parties which are more national or more closure-oriented in cultural or economic terms. And there are different labels for that, for these party families: TAN versus GAL, traditional, authoritarian, national, green, alternative, left. Somewhere, anywhere is maybe a term you have heard: cosmopolitans versus communitarians, or particularism versus universalism. So it's always the same story. So we have a new globalization-related cleavages. Globalization creates new groups of winners and losers, mainly those people at the bottom with low skills, low education. They probably belong more to the communitarian camp, whereas the high-skilled, highly educated, urban people belong to those who embrace cosmopolitan values. So, of course, we have to have a nice story around that. And I thought, yeah, maybe we can, as Branko Milanovic worked with an elephant, I thought we can use a camel. And so a one-humped, I think it's called hump, and the two-humped camel, so a dromedary or a Bactrian camel. And the first one would be a society which is very much like a normal distribution. So you have most people in the center and fewer people at the margins. And the other one is a two-camp society, so where you have two different camps and in between a great difference. And this is a stylized, idealized picture of the cleavage story I told you before. So these would be the communitarians, the other one would be the cosmopolitans. But in our book, we are skeptical whether this is a good and true story. And we looked at data, so longitudinal data since 1990s in different conflict arenas. And we also gathered own survey data, and we also did qualitative studies, mainly focus groups. And so the punchline here is that we say, yeah, maybe we are not characterized by just one conflict arena. It's not maybe just the economic conflict and the cultural conflict. Maybe we need to differentiate that a little bit more. And we are, so together with Linus Westhäuser and Thomas Lux, we are inequality researchers and political sociologists. We thought we go a little bit more into the society, as you said before. And there are more conflicts. So you have conflicts around identity politics, you have conflicts around migration issues, you have conflicts about climate mitigation, and so on. And what is an inequality conflict? I would always say there's a certain desired or valued good at stake, and that can be economic resources, but that can also be membership, that can also be recognition, that can also be a kind of environmental goods. So there's a varieties of different goods people debate about, or where conflicts, structural conflicts may arise. First message, Germany is not America, so we are not such a highly polarized society. So many comparative studies have shown that too. But there's also little change over time. So it's not that you have a divergence of different opinion classes or groups. It's not that you have an emerging two-camp society, but the patterns, the attitudinal patterns, are relatively stable over time, even in conflictuous areas like migration. So attitudes towards minority rights, globalization, migration, European integration are extremely stable over time. It's quite surprising. If you observe the public debate, you would probably come to a different conclusion. And there's neither a class war in Germany nor a cultural war. So there are no clearly distinguishable groups. Most people are somehow in the middle. It's more dromedary style. And so we would say people are neither, the majority are neither cosmopolitans nor communitarians. In this book, we develop a kind of heuristic or analytical scheme to put all these different conflicts in one picture. And of course, we need good labels for that. And we call those top-bottom conflicts, inside-outside conflicts, us and them conflicts, and today-tomorrow conflicts. The first one is the classical distributional conflict between classes. Of course, now driven by the return of inequality, so greater inequalities in income and wealth distribution. The second one is the conflict over borders, so everything related to migration, membership, access to a territory. The third one is us and them. Usually you would talk about a struggle for recognition or identity politics related to ethnic discrimination, sexual identity, minority rights. And the final one is the climate conflicts. So it's everything that is related to the climate, global warming, or the mitigation measures related to that. So what's the outcome? So we have written very lengthy chapters on each of these areas, but I can say only a few words for each of them. So the classical industrial conflict between the classes has changed drastically. And we would say we live in a demobilized class society. Class still matters in terms of inequality, but it does not matter in relation to the consciousness of the people. However, 80% of the people say inequalities are too high. But this is a view that is taken by all classes. So it's not related to the working class. But at the same time, if you ask people, should we change our tax system? Or should we increase social assistance? People are relatively reluctant to support these measures. Otherwise, you could say 80% are skeptical of high inequalities. So these are the best times for left parties. So I go to the marketplace, I say inheritance tax and wealth tax, and I get a majority. But this is not the case. So people lament and they complain about high inequalities, but at the same time, they are not willing to support measures for stronger redistribution. And it's very interesting that the working classes or the manual workers are most skeptical. For example, with regard to the increase of so-called Bürgergeld, so a kind of social assistance scheme in Germany. The same is true for meritocracy. If you look at data from 1970, then most people who cherish meritocracy come from the top of society. The lower classes are skeptical. They say we are not living in a meritocratic society. Now, this is a view that is held by basically all classes and most strongly by the working class. They commit most to the principle of meritocracy. It's a very interesting finding. You had a PhD here at Harvard University, I think at the center, Jonathan Mies, and he wrote about the paradox of meritocracy. He found out, interesting and it fits our story, he found out that with increased inequalities, people embrace the principle of meritocracy more. And normally you would think it should be the other way around, because the distances between the classes and the income groups increase. Inside-outside conflicts, we always had 20% since the 70s of the people who were skeptical about migration, who had racist or ethno-nationalist attitudes. This is very stable over time. But nowadays, more people say we live in a migration society. Migration is something that is needed for labor market purposes, and we also have humanitarian commitments to people in need, refugees and asylum seekers, but still they make very strong distinctions between good migrants and bad migrants. Good migrants are those who adjust, who integrate, who learn the language, who pay taxes, and bad migrants are those who do not follow the rules or the expectations of the majority. And it's a very moral understanding of migration related to deservingness criteria. But what has changed in relation to migration is that the attitudes toward migration are much stronger predictor for voting choice. In former time, people had these attitudes, but it did not play out in an election. So it was totally irrelevant. People were members of the Social Democratic Party, and they voted for them for social economic issues. They had their attitudes towards migration, but it did not play out in an election. Now it's different. Issue salience is much higher, in particular for the lower classes. For them, the migration issue is very often decisive for electoral behavior. Us and them, identity politics. I know it's a very fierce conflict about everything that is related to identity, but if you look long term, then we have an enormous liberalization of society. It's really a success story. Even data from the beginning of the 90s, 50% of the respondents said homosexuality is a disease. It's unbelievable. We cannot think about this nowadays in these terms. But and homosexuality in the standard social science surveys was part of an item battery on deviant behavior, together with shoplifting and other stuff. So our mindset has changed totally. And it's not just an issue of the higher classes and the higher educated, also the lower classes, the manual workers, they have become extremely tolerant. So this kind of social norm or value change has diffused through the society. Still, there are conflicts. What kind of conflicts are we talking about? We use a term by Rainer Forst, a German social philosopher, who talked about Erlaubnistoleranz. So I don't know whether this is a permissive tolerance. So you simply accept that people have a different lifestyle or different sexual orientation. And this is shared by most people. And then he talks about so-called Wertschätzungs- oder Respekttoleranz. So, I don't know, appreciative tolerance that goes much further. And this is shared only by part of society. What's the difference? One is that everyone can live as you want, as long as it is not politicized, as long as it stays a private matter. As soon as people go out and politicize the issue, if you have CSD or events or rainbow flags on public buildings, people from the lower classes become extremely skeptical. Also in relation to changes in languages, use of language, and so on. So they want to have that as a private matter and not more. So this is a conflict we are talking about. And finally, today, tomorrow has a very high salience. So most people have a very high awareness of climate change made by humans. And we have no conflict that is probably relevant in the US context between people who deny that climate change exists and people who believe in science. In Germany, you have a very small number, less than 10%, who would be skeptical about the fact that climate change exists. Most people say it exists and it's a problem and politics have to do something about it. But still we have different understandings. And we talk about, it's a class conflict in progress, because you can see very distinct understandings of the ecological question in relation to the working class or in relation to the middle class. The middle class thinks about the ecological question in terms of lifestyle, consumption choices. So I can become more sustainable just by going to Bioladen or a kind of local shop or buying an electric car and so on. And the lower class think about the ecological questions in socio-economic terms. Can I afford it? Is it becoming too costly for me? Completely different understandings. And very often I'm at political events and we have to inform the people that climate change takes place and that we have to do something about it. I said, this is useless because all people know. They are simply afraid that the burden sharing of the socio-ecological transformation is unfair and that they might suffer in the mid or in the long run. So that's a basic difference. if you, I mean, we have used a scheme by Daniel Oesch, it's a Swiss sociology on classes, to look where the different classes are positioned. So each of these conflict areas was measured, I don't know, with 10 different items, and we built a composite index. And you can see top, bottom, most progressive are not the production workers, so most redistributive, one would say, but the cultural experts. So people like we, or people working in media and culture, and of course, small business owners and employers are on the other side. This is the old industrial conflict. These are the post-industrial conflicts. And here the pattern is, in these different arenas, is always the same, and it's different to the first one. Here you have most progressives are usually cultural experts, management, technical experts in all three conflict arenas, and lows, production workers, production workers, production workers. So it has shifted. The social structure of these conflicts has shifted totally, and that makes it very complicated for political parties to deal with these questions. So these are so-called density distribution. You could see there's not so much conflict. There's a lot of overlap, and all that looks a little bit like a dromedary, doesn't it? Dromedary shaped. And if you would have a highly polarized, divided society, you should at least see, when you look at the class structure, that there are differences. But most people somehow cluster at the same point. The interesting question for cleavage theory is, of course, whether there are systematic links between the different conflict arenas. So we have disaggregated first, and now we aggregate it again, because we ask what are the relations, the links between these different arenas. Because if we have cleavage structure, we would have a kind of syndromization of attitudes. So things which would belong together. So if I'm open to migration, I should also be very tolerant with regard to sexual identity issues. I would also be very positive about climate mitigation measures. So these things should always come together. And the assumption, only if that happens, you have certain camps. But if this is randomly distributed, it's very unlikely that you have these kind of camps. But we have also, from Converse and others, very early studies which give you an idea that the coherence, the ideological coherence, is very different whether you talk about high status people or low status people. And so for the upper classes, they are very often in situations where they have to present themselves as coherent in ideological terms. They have an elaborated language to talk about politics. For the lower classes, this is not the case. It's very patchworky. So they make experiences, they know exactly what's wrong or right, fair or unfair, but it's not related to a coherent ideological belief system. And here it's a very simple thing here. I just correlated the different conflict arenas, and you can see you would have very high correlations if there would be a systematic relation between those. Top, bottom versus inside, outside, so redistribution versus migration, hardly any relation for the general population. Also with the identity politics and so on. It's a bit more here for identity politics and climate, migration, and identity politics. So it's a bit higher. Now, if you distinguish high and low-level education people, you will see the consistency is much higher for the higher education people and much lower, if existed at all, for lower educational classes. What's the message here? When we talk about cleavages, it's mostly a talk by highly educated people who mirror or who try to think in political terms about other social groups that originate from themselves. So they simply think, if we are this way, then the others must be the opposite. And I think it's really a problem of perspective. So they do not understand that people in lower classes or lower occupational positions have very little opportunities to express themselves politically. So they do not develop a coherent, very often coherent belief system. That does not mean that they are totally naive. They have very strong views on different issues, but they are not linked to an official discourse or to a party program or the like. So that makes a big difference. So the book is called Trigger Points, so I should also talk a little bit about the trigger points. Now I painted maybe a bit too rosy picture of a highly integrated, consensual society where you have a few conflicts, but overall people still will find common ground and so on. This is something what struck us too, because we read the media, we see public discourse, and the concept of trigger points came up when we observed our focus groups and did qualitative studies. What did we do? First, we discussed different issues. Very often people had a very natural way. They agreed on some issues, they disagreed on others, and it was a not very emotional discussion. But what we did then, we took headlines from German newspapers and magazines where we thought they are most controversial, and put for each of the conflict arenas 10 on the table, and people could choose what upsets them most. And they took it, and then they read it out loud, and the others reacted. And you had a completely different atmosphere, because certainly the temperature in the room got up. People became more energetic, more engaged in the discussion. You could see the body language and the way they expressed themselves. So the mood changed fully, so completely. And we thought, yeah, maybe this is an interesting thing, because we realized in some arenas you can discuss things easily, and you could even accept disagreements. In with other issues, people really get emotional, and we thought, these trigger points might be something like emotionalized breaking points in the public discourse, neuralgic issues where consensus, acceptance, and indifference turn into dissent and contestations. And we argue in the book this is linked to moral assumptions or very deeply held moral concerns or convictions, which are then triggered and where people react more strongly. What type of statements were these? Habeck, so the German Minister of Economy, he wants, he put a bill on the table which caused many discussions in Germany. Habeck will Energiestasi einsetzen, so people are forced to change their heating system at home by a kind of Stasi. Second was also a debate. Imagine, Germany has so many problems. We debate 6 weeks about development aid for Peru, 5 million euro for a cycling path in Peru. And this also raised a lot of concerns. There was an exhibition in Essen where on Saturday only non-white people could go to create a safe space, and it was an exhibition on post-colonialism. And that did upset many people. Even if they would never have gone to this place, they would probably have did not know about the exhibition place, nor the exhibition itself. And of course, a statement by Friedrich Merz, the maybe future Chancellor of Germany, where he claimed all asylum seekers, they go to the dentist. And this is a very typical trigger point. Why? Because, you try to get an appointment with a dentist, you sit in the waiting room, someone is coming in, looks different than you, and is jumping the queue. So that upsets many people, so they get very emotional about that, and there was a big discussion on that. So these are typical trigger point themes. And what we develop here, I cannot go into detail, is a kind of analytical scheme where we would say these trigger points are related to 4 aspects. And since the book has been published, I observe all the public debates and try to relate it to our taxonomy of trigger themes. And it works very well. You can basically, and I guess it can even travel to the US debate. You can basically capture all the different trigger themes by relating them to these kind of deeply held understandings. So first is unequal treatments. You have an understanding of equality, justice, fairness, and if this is violated, people get very upset. It's interesting, one of the most triggering headlines was Friday afternoon, opening hours in public swimming pools in Berlin for trans persons. And you had these people who said, I have homosexual friends, I'm extremely tolerant, I even know trans persons, I'm very fond of them. And as soon as this headline came on the table, they changed totally. And one could say, are they transphobic? I don't know. But what they had, what happened in the head of their minds is they saw that these places are overcrowded every day, and Friday afternoon there are two people swimming alone. So they have framed it very often as a justice issue. Violations of normality is also something that triggers people, so they have a certain behavioral expectation how people should behave and what they should do, and if you deviate from that, they react very strongly. Fears of dissolution of boundaries. Of course, this is related to fortification of borders or measures of migration control, but it's also related, for example, to minority rights. Very often people thought equality is good, non-discrimination is good, but if we gave them the small finger, they take the whole hand. Tomorrow they come with the next thing, what they want. They thought it's an inflation of demands, so they come up with more and more, and it becomes uncontrollable. And the fourth one is unreasonable behavioral demands. So people have their habits, people have their customary behavior, and if there's a policy intervention into that, they react very strongly. I talked about the heating system, the change of the private heating system, but also all language issues. So language policies are very strongly rejected by a larger part of people, but also speed control or speed limitation at German motorways is also a very triggering issue, obviously, though one could say, oh, my God, what's the problem? And you drive just a little bit, not as much. Okay. To understand the current political situation in Germany, I think one should also look at the processes of change. And I like to work with the term change fatigue or society exhausted by change. Veränderungserschöpfung oder Veränderungsmüdigkeit in German. So many people use that word by now, but I still think that it explains very well why many people react strongly to changes in the political arena, but also changes in society. There's a large fraction of society that thinks that it's more difficult to keep up. So society is speeding up, things become more complicated, more complex. I'm not understanding the world anymore in which I'm living, and I'm not able to cope with all these changes. We have more than 40% of people in Germany who would claim they are not able to keep up anymore, and it has a very strong social bias. So the more economic resources the people have, the more cognitive skills and cultural capital, the better they cope with change. Very often people in the lower positions of the labor market who basically receive directions and who have little autonomy in their professional life are also overwhelmed by processes of change. And I have a second concept that is political anger. It's a very, so we have measured them now in many different ways, but here's the most simple way. Do political discussion often make you angry? Also here, many people say that, and we also have a situation where most right-wing, so anger is more a right-wing thing than a left-wing thing, but it's highly also related to change fatigue. Here, a proportion of angry individuals by income. The lower your income position, the more angry you are if you observe political debates or political situation. And this is the relation between political anger and change fatigue. So here are the people who say, I'm not keeping up with a change in society, and they are extremely angry. So it makes you feel helpless, powerless, lack of control, lack of self-efficacy. So these are very strong syndromes in a society, and I think with such a measure you can explain a lot. I just reviewed a paper, interesting paper, on gender equity, how is it called in English? Equitable language, and where this kind of change fatigue is the most powerful predictor among many other potential explanations. So it's an extremely powerful predictor. So the overall story of our book is polarization is not something that is already there in the social structure. So we have no proper, clearly distinguishable camps in society, which are only then reflected in the political arena. It's more the other way around. So polarization is coming from the top and then moving to the bottom. Polarization is produced, made, triggered by political actors, by polarization entrepreneurs. So politics is much more divided than society, and you have a polarization through politicization. So the activities, the actions of political actors are more important than what you already have as a society as such. And what is very important here is, of course, effective politics, or politics of effect, so where you really try to emotionalize people to reshuffle the political arena and bring people into your camp. Here is the distribution of the electorates. So it's not party programs, but it's electorates in these different camps. Top bottom, I mean, this is what you would expect. Maybe I go to the next one. What you would expect. Left party is more redistributive, market-oriented is the FDP. In all other arenas, you have a clustering of the major parties in the middle. So their electorates cannot be distinguished anymore in terms of the positioning in these conflict arenas. If we would have just Green Party electorates and AfD electorates, we would have a two-camp society. We would be a very divided society, but most people are here. These people together are 35% of our population, but 65% are in the middle. For the parties, the situation is extremely difficult because they have no unique programmatic selling points anymore. So how can you attract people if they all have the same view? It's very difficult to differentiate and to have a kind of partisan sorting or party alignment, because these people are simply together. If you look at party programs, they are more different, but the electorates basically are lumped together. It's a very difficult situation. What do you do as a political actor in that situation? You scan the public discourse, whether you find trigger points. You say, asylum seekers, go to the dentist. I mean, you have maybe not a substantive difference so it's more symbolic politics. It's not really related to the content or problem solving. So you have to have a strategy for arousing people, for making them more emotional, to reshuffle the political landscape. And this is what we can observe. Therefore, trigger points are very important wedge issues where you can introduce differences which do not exist at the ideological level. So the views people hold are very closely together. So you need to trigger them in one way or the other. Also here, I mean, I had this before for the classes. Here you could see, okay, there's still some overlap, but of course, I mean, the Green Party and the AfD are somehow outlier. What you can do, I mean, we have done it before. Sarah Wagenknecht split up with the Partei Die Linke, but with this density distribution, I mean, here you see a two-camp party or even a three-camp party. So the left party with Sarah Wagenknecht was united just on the redistributive issue. Here, here, and here, you had two or even three parties in one. So it was quite natural that they have to follow different pathways. Again, conflicts are created, polarization is generated politically and through media. Polarization is not inherently present as a pre-political social structural cleavage, but perceived polarization, if we all think polarization is there, may lead to real polarization. There's some US research now on that. So if people really believe in a two-camp society and there's a new political issue coming up, you always think, so where's my group? Where can I affiliate and where are the others? So in the long run, if you have the belief you live in a two-camp society, there might be a two-camp society emerging. And shifting issue salience affects voting behavior, and trigger points are wedge issues. It's coming back, my last two slides, coming back to the current political landscape. Some people, like my colleague Andreas Reckwitz, have said, so the traffic light coalition is an anti-polarization coalition because it unified political parties which naturally would not go together. Okay, this came to an end, was probably overstretching ideological overlaps or even differences. We have this kind of very strong non-alignment and lack of sorting of the side and middle. So most people are somehow indifferent. I have not such a strong views, in particular on the newer conflict arenas. We have low attachments, and parties are becoming now structural weaklings. So in Germany, parties are organized on the basis of membership. If you look at the large parties, SPD, CDU, or even the FDP, they have lost 50% of their members since 1990. In East Germany, 0.8 out of 100 people are member of a party at all. So they have very, very low entrenchment in the local communities. And of course, we have an end of people's parties. Even the larger parties get maximum 30%. The SPD had in former times 40 or 42%. Now they are down to 15. We will have a situation of more political blockage. Why is that? Because we have the two chambers, so the German Bundestag, but also the Bundesrat, so Federal Council, where the different German lenders are represented. And there we have very different coalitions, very often two, sometimes even three different parties, and across the whole spectrum. And if they do not agree on an issue, they abstain from voting. In the German Bundesrat, non-voting means a no. So many laws, many bills have to pass both chambers. So if you have now a government, coalition government of two or three, and you have the Bundesrat, there will be very few possibilities to get something through. So we have very high demand for political decision and very little ability to bring that through both chambers. And I think we are also running in a situation of government overload. I know this is a story of the 70s where you had this all this discussion on ungovernability, but the German way of finding compromise is always compensation, so spending money. But this kind of mode is exhausted by now due to the debt break, but also due to lack of fiscal resources and the difficulties of the economy. So I think we will have a more intense situation of conflict over the next year, also with more maybe distributional conflict. And the center parties have no proper reform project, so they shy away from any fundamental decision. We have a very strong East-West divide. Just this one slide. So East and West Germany, the GDR, the Federal Republic of Germany, come clearly out. This is the first vote on the local candidates, and you see the SPD, the red, is nearly disappearing. It's all CDU in the West, and it's all AfD coming first in the East. So a very clear picture of a politically divided country. My very last slide, I said we will have more politics of effect, more politicization, maybe more contestation. The CDU and the CSU currently try to revitalize the central or middle left or middle right divide with some kind of demonization of the Greens, also with the introduction of cultural war issues. The SPD is stuck with their old program, and they face new challenges. They are reluctant to live up to these new challenges. I think the AfD is following the way to further radicalization, so it's not becoming a bourgeois or a center party, but at the same time we have normalization of certain framings that relates to the AfD, and we have an issue ownership of everything that is about migration. The Greens have moved to the center, also due to the Russian war in Ukraine, but they are now confronted with a lot of skepticism. So a lot of people are very negative about the Greens and also the failures in the last government. BSW, it's not clear whether they will enter the Bundestag. The liberals in Germany, they try to turn a bit more libertarian. The chairperson, Christian Lindner, said we need more Musk and Milei in Germany. So he tries to play a little bit with this kind of disruption ideology, and we have a resurgence of the left. This is a development since 2 weeks maybe because of the situation in the Bundestag and the harsh migration measures. I think we move from a frozen landscape to a more conflict-laden political space. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we have till 5:30, and we have a room full of very smart and interested people who I'm sure have lots of questions. But I will maybe, although I have many questions, I'll just ask one question because it seems like it's probably something that allows you to talk about ongoing work and so on. So, I mean, a lot of this research is based on a single moment, or whatever the period in which you were studying. I mean, is your sense? I mean, you hinted at this a bit in your discussion that the activation of these trigger points, if these aren't cleavages, are they creating cleavages? I mean, there's a bit of a paradox in your finding in the end that although society is not polarized, at the end the party landscape seems to be. So is that because these trigger points are in fact, this politicization is creating a polarized society, or is it that this polarization is taking place, political polarization is taking place despite the continued absence of societal polarization?
Maybe both. I mean, I would say that political parties, they try to become distinguishable and to make certain programmatic offers, but they play with issues which have a high salience. So they very often, themes or topics which are part of the program are not mentioned at all in public. And so they emphasize those where they think they can gain some honey out of it. And I mean, at least in my view, so they all wait for things that happen in the public discourse. So they are not putting up their own agenda. They are simply waiting for what happens, and then they see how they position themselves. There was a very nice interview with a person responsible for the strategic development of the AfD, and they asked him, so what are you doing? How are you? He said, we are not doing anything. We simply wait for the next theme that comes up, and that makes people upset somehow. And then we look how the Green position themselves, and then we say the opposite.
As we see here.
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
always on.
This is exactly their strategy. And if you have voters which are tied or who are tied to one party, then these emotional trigger themes do not matter that much because people, nonetheless, they vote for the same party. And in Germany, we always had milieus which are related to certain parties. If you say someone is working in metal industry and a member of the trade union, then you can exactly predict what kind of party he or she would vote. But this is now crumbling or dismantling, so there's a lot of change, and then people become more sensitive to this public discourse level. So they react more strongly, and if you have the wrong candidate and so on, they might shift or move to someone else. So there's more volatility in the electorate, and it becomes more difficult for political parties to keep people in their camp. And I think this is a fundamental change, also due to the lack of membership. If you have very strong local units of the party or local departments of the party, they are very influential also for the local political culture. In East Germany, for example, for mayors and Landräte, how we call that, 50% of them have no party membership anymore, 50%. And the number is increasing rapidly. So the parties have no influence on the ground anymore. And so they live more from media appearance, from public discourse, rather than from a stable membership.
Okay, so I already have some hands up. If people would like to make a comment or ask a question, rather, I should say, make a comment with a question at the end. Really ask a question. Please raise your hand, and I'm keeping track of a list here. And please introduce yourself, if you could, just very briefly. So I think I see first on my list, in the far back, Grzegorz Ekiert.
I'm Grzegorz Ekiert, Professor of Government. Thank you, Stefan. This was amazing research, and I would like to ask the question, but first I have a footnote. Stephen Ansolo Behera, who is our colleague in the department working on American politics, makes a very similar argument that Americans are much less divided than the political sphere would suggest. But my question is about those arenas, and I'm surprised that, or I'm missing one, right? I'm missing the arena which relates to issues of security, foreign aid, international relations, and EU, right? When you look at the countries I'm most familiar with in sort of former Eastern Europe, these are the most important polarizing issues, right? In Slovakia, in Bulgaria, in Serbia, in Hungary, in Poland. How do you deal with Americans and Germans and Russians? How much do you want to help Ukraine and so on? So it seems to me that in sort of era of globalization, those international issues should be, and there are, at the center of kind of political fights and conflicts and struggles. So I wonder whether this is something which is peculiar to Germany, that this is not really, the most consuming and overwhelming issues as it is in Poland or some other countries.
Before you answer, because we have so many questions, I'm going to collect a couple, and then hopefully you can address them. Also, so next on my list is David Spring.
David Spring, I'm a historian here. So, if I understood you correctly, in the very beginning you said that attitudes towards migration are relatively stable, but the way that is weighted is not necessarily stable. And I'm sort of thinking of the early 90s, for example, where migration was also a big issue. But it seems to me you were also sort of implying, you didn't say it, which was elegant, but you seem to be sort of implying that there's a whole range of economic problems that not only the parties don't really have an answer to, but that might actually be really hard to solve at the level of a nation state in Europe right now. And so I was wondering if that is a qualitatively new situation, and if that sort of explains the sort of overwhelming emphasis on migration in the last few months. And then if I can ask a really quick, unrelated question, is there a desire for polarization, not just among political elites and parties, but is there also a desire for polarization, perhaps in the population, as we, for example, had in the 1960s, when the sort of big public criticism was that the Grand Coalition was essentially stagnant, there was no opposition, there were no sort of big issues, or as they were during the pandemic, where there was a sort of sense that, you know, it didn't really matter which party people belonged to, they were all sort of agreeing on what needs to be done now. So is there also a sort of bottom-up desire for polarization that doesn't exist, analogous to the top-down attempt to differentiate?
So that there's more choice or something.
Yeah.
Okay, one final question before we turn back. David Art. Yeah.
Thank you very much. David Art, professor of political science at Tufts. I'm super sympathetic to your argument. I mean, it sounds a little analogous to Larry Bartels' book, Democracy Arose from the Top. It's like classic John Zoller, so great. And I also like it how you sort of revise a conventional wisdom of Germany being a center-right country. I mean, your stuff tells a very, very different story. Here's my question, and see if you'd be open to this interpretation. Is perhaps what we're seeing in Germany kind of, in a way, Madison's dream come true about all sorts of cross-cutting cleavages, creating this, you know, consensus society, except in East Germany, where we have super reinforcing cleavages. When you put up the AfD vote, that was wonderful. And as you know, if you zoom in there, where it will look more rural, right? So the cities, Leipzig and all will have a different color. And what are you picking up there? You're picking up East German, you're picking up rural to some degree, so geography, and you're also picking up gender, right? To a very large degree as well, in addition to all sorts of other stuff. So what would you think about that idea, that it is kind of like American society 70 years ago of cross-cutting cleavages, except you just got one area that's really reinforcing?
Yeah, I very much had the same thought. That this sounded like, you know, Robert Dahl's vision of pluralist heaven. You know, and when you speak to, I was recently speaking to somebody from the AFL-CIO, and the way he says is, you know, that the pluralism worked because there was a strong labor movement as the counterweight. And so is that maybe what's preserving this, and is that diminishing? So to follow up on David's book, yeah.
Yeah, but maybe I have to frame the book again. So the idea was, can you understand the political conflict in Germany by cleavage theory? And I would say to a limited extent, because the conflicts are arena specific. And then there are cross-cutting cleavages, and they do not, all the different arenas are not fully overlapping, and that's good, because you have no formation of clear-cut differences between segments of society, and very often people are also indifferent, so they have an opinion, but this is not so relevant for them, and of course there are some cleavages which are more prominent. I think that in Germany we also have an educational divide. We have this East-West divide. AfD is mainly a male party, so 80% of their members are men, and they have also more supporters, more voters, male voters. But still, I would say, if you compare that with other societies, Germany is less polarized. If you compare to Poland, for example, or if you compare to the US, or even to the UK, it's less polarized, and it's also related to our party system and the electoral system. So if you form coalitions, you cannot be an enemy of each other. So you cannot say the other one wants to finish this country, or it just causes problems. So somehow it's also a debate now. I mean, what happens after the February 23rd? You have to form a coalition. And what will you say to your electorate if you say before, I mean, they are basically ruining Germany. And then you have very different coalitions at the Länder level. That's also cross-cutting and very different color combinations. And I think this is a very strong institutional precondition for less polarized society. But the East-West thing is for me also astonishing. You have that in relation to many different indicators too. So income, migration, and so on. I mean, you will find that across the board. And I think this is a remaining or persistent structural difference within Germany. The question of desire for polarization, yeah, maybe for the outsiders. I mean, this is also an AfD argument. They always say so. They are the system parties, and they all want the same. And we are the only ones who make a difference. I think for a minority of the people, it's true. So they want to have more polarization. But most people, I mean, when you ask them, what do you think is the biggest problem? Or then they would say that the society becomes more polarized. So it's a negative vision. I have seen data yesterday, 70% of the people say Germany is becoming more polarized. A year ago, it was 48%. But I do not think that they would value it as a very good thing rather than a very bad thing. And most people also look at the US and they would say this is a very negative example. This is a development which we do not want to have in Germany. So they see it rather as a big problem, I would say. But I see your point. The economic problems, I think they were always there. Maybe Germany was sleeping in the bed and someone took the blanket, but they have not realized yet. Now you wake up and you suddenly freeze. And I think that happened long years ago. And you can see that in terms of productivity or industrial production and so on. These figures go down since 2017. So it's a longer story. It's partly also unrelated to the current government. But still the problems are there, and we can expect that we have more distributional conflicts. We already had that with relation to the military aid for Ukraine. Grzegorz point, yes, I agree fully. Why didn't we take that in? Because we are inequality researchers. So I just look at let's say, inequality conflicts, what I said, where there's a certain good, desired good at stake. And of course, people can have different views on abortion or on the EU, but this would not fall into our competency. So we concentrate on these kind of structural, typical inequality conflicts, which are also long-term. Some of the other conflicts may disappear. So if you think about the Middle East, of course, this has impacted the German public, and it's also partly divided on that. But I hope this will be a conflict that does not become permanent.
Great, thank you. So, okay, we have some other questions here. Let me if you raise your hand, I'll make a note of you. We'll have to collect 4, I think, this time. Okay. So first in the back of the room.
Thanks so much. My name is William Stewart. I'm a lecturer in the German department here. I have mostly an invitation for more elaboration. There's a point you had early on about the relationship between, especially among production workers, increased inequality and an embrace of meritocracy. I think my question is about, are those simply correlated, or is the relationship there more explicit? So is it the case that in Germany you see an embrace of meritocracy as a solution by these individuals, seen as a solution to inequality, or something more complicated going on there? So thank you very much.
Peter Hall.
Peter Hall from the Center for European Studies. I had 2 quick questions. One, when people write about polarization, they can mean 2 different things. They can mean a division of opinion, so like your camel with 2 humps, or they can mean effective polarization. That is to say, politics has become more emotional. People express greater dislike of other parties and relative to the like of their own party. And I wonder, when you argue that we aren't seeing polarization in Germany, whether that might apply to the first kind of polarization, but we might nonetheless be seeing affective polarization, which is of course most commonly associated with the rise of right populist parties like the AfD. And my second question is, so I think I understood from your last response, which of an amazing study, it's also amazing that you could present it in such a short space. But so I think I understood that your argument is that there isn't a cleavage in Germany because of the diffuseness of people's policy views, broadly speaking. But wouldn't you be willing to say that there is a cleavage based on winners and losers? You know, these 44% of people who say that they're overwhelmed by change, the change fatigue you're talking about, 3/4 of whom say they're angry. So maybe if we look in conventional policy terms, we see something that's Dahl-like, pluralist-like. But maybe there is a cleavage, and maybe it really is winners, losers.
So we're using the wrong cleavage categories, essentially. There are cleavages, but just the traditional ones. Yeah, very good. Laura.
Hi, Laura Yappi. I'm a political scientist based at the business school. 2 questions. The first is on trigger points. I just want to better conceptualize this. So are you thinking about folks who are not yet politically activated, who through these trigger points are brought into the political conversation and sort of latent support becomes more active support? Or do you actually see trigger points strategically used to move people, say, from the CDU to AfD or sort of to the next closest party on the ideological spectrum, but sort of already politically activated? So just wanted a little clarification there. And then the idea of the word fatigue and change fatigue is interesting, and I wanted you to elaborate on what purchase you get out of using the word fatigue rather than resistance or disinterest in. Like, what exactly is it about it that's fatigue? Because to me, the way I think about it is these are folks who don't want to be called out if they don't use pronouns correctly or whatever, but have all the best meaning, sort of ideological commitment to sort of embracing change. That's one way to think about it. And then there's folks who might have fatigue and are like, I have zero interest in embracing new political concepts or ideologies move forward. And so I just wanted to get a better sense of what you think is actually going on for the angry fatigue type. Thanks.
So if we haven't fatigued you too much, I'll add one more question to the list.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this amazing talk. So I understand your point about polarizations and it's regarded as a negative thing, but I have a harder time to understand if consensual politics is actually a positive thing, especially when the whole world is actually getting divided from the Middle East to the US about issues that Germany refuses to divide, like genocide, like race. I mean, I understand that race has been a taboo word, even in academia, in Italy and Germany for so long, but now Germany has the largest population of racial migrants, Muslims and Black. And yet, I mean, Greece or Italy is actually more divided about race and migration than Germany. Anyway, I mean, I just wonder how we should understand this overwhelmingly consensual politics in Germany, despite the fact that there is issues that divide the whole world, and the world is dividing about Germany's perspective. So
this sounds more like Dahl's 1950s America than we might think, actually. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, we are not emphasizing that consensus is always good. So I'm more in a Georg Simmel tradition, where I think there's also a positivity of conflict. I mean, if we wouldn't have conflict, it would be very boring. But the question is, what kind of conflict do we have? And if conflict polarizes and you cannot solve any problems anymore, or you cannot form a government, or you are an enemy of each other, then it's a completely different issue than having different views on the same theme. And therefore, I mean, can also go back to conflict theory of Dahrendorf and others. Social change always will bring about conflicts. So we would not have universal suffrage, or we would have still a lot of also racial discrimination without conflict. So minority groups challenge the existing order, and I think that is fair and that is very good. But the cleavage structures are of a different type. So I'm not saying that conflict is something negative. But of course, I'm interested in the kind of productive dealing with conflicts. And this is our point of view here. Change fatigue and resistance. I mean, when I came up with the idea of that change fatigue might be so important, I worked on East Germany. And here we have a situation that a lot of people say, I'm exhausted by change. Not because they are not well off, but it's due to their biographic experience. So they transformed everything, every aspect of their life. And it was very stressful and demanding. And so they needed maybe 10 or 15 years to have safe ground under their feet to reestablish themselves. And now new things come. Society gets more diverse. We have digitization, the geopolitical situation, and they say, I do not want anymore. I have the means. I'm not in a very bad economic situation, but I have already experienced so much change that I cannot do that anymore. And this is this kind of tiredness of change. And I think we can discuss it maybe, but I still think that it's a very good concept, because these kind of subjective feelings are very often unrelated to an ideological positioning. As I said before, the paper I just reviewed, it's not yet published, on gender equitable language. They also tested all different attitudes towards gender roles. Had hardly any effect. As soon as you took change fatigue into the models, all these effects became insignificant. And also status-related variables. So I think if we use the term left behind, we can use it in an economic way, and we can use it in a temporal way. And I think the temporal effect is stronger, Peter, so that, the society, the change is accelerating drastically. So the world as it was will not be existent tomorrow or the day after. And I think this is historically unprecedented, that there's so much change. If I would fall asleep now for 2 years, I would wake up, probably the world would look totally different. And we had in former times stabilities over generations. So it's a very demanding situation for individuals, but also for collectivities. And I guess we have to deal more with these kind of phenomena. Peter, as I said, maybe losers and winners is a significant category. I would not deny that, and there's a very strong link to social status and also resources and individual capacities. But still, as I said, the temporal dimension is very important, and I think it has a separate impact. It's a different view on that. It's not. We have very often economically well-positioned people in East Germany who vote for the AfD. They are, I don't know, handymen, or they are employers and so on. They all vote for the AfD, not because they are economically less well off or they have a low economic status. It's because of the experience or the non-acceptance of ongoing change. I think that's very important for me. With regard to affective polarization, we have worked on affective polarization. In Germany, it's not going up, apart from the relation to the AfD. But we always had a high affective polarization when a new party entered the German Bundestag. That was 1983 with the Greens, 1990 with the PDS, or the left party, and that was 1917 when the AfD came into parliament. And then there's a very strong dislike of all the other parties vis-à-vis the AfD, and then over time it disappears. So the effective polarization gets lower. But it's very important. I put the slide out, but I think what we found, for example, we put up social figures and asked people whether you like or dislike them. An asylum seeker or SUV driver or a feminist and so on. And the most polarizing social figures were those which you could label as protagonists of social change. They were so extreme in the feelings. So some people had extreme positive feelings, and some people have had extreme negative feelings. It was so it fits very well to the story of change fatigue. So with regard to the first question, the meritocracy inequality relation, I think the old class conflict, the vertical class conflict, has become a horizontal conflict, a moralized conflict about deservingness. So the working class is dealing very often with issues of legitimate entitlements towards social benefits, of migrants, of people not working, not being able to work, or not being willing to work. So all the political energy or social energy goes into that conflict and is less related to this kind of vertical class conflict. And so the meritocracy issue is very much related to deservingness criteria. Who is entitled to what? And I think this is a new type of story and a diverted class conflict. So the class conflict is now very often between groups which are in the social neighborhood of the working class, but supposedly not willing to engage in kind of productive life. And here we have much more conflict out in the German situation than with regard to rich or super income people.
So I think we have time. There's a lot of questions, but we only have time for one last question. And I know this will disappoint everybody, but Bjorn, you're go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, I'm honored to be the lucky one. Björn Bremer, I'm a visiting fellow at the Center for European Studies here. I actually had a question about production workers, but I think you mostly addressed. But just to reiterate the point, in Germany, relatively speaking to other countries, production workers have been relatively well off. At least until 2022, right? Industrialization or the industrial sector remains strong. The wages in the industrial sector increased much more than in other sectors. And so I was wondering what explains, if it is not sort of economic loss, what in your view explains, and the curious case of the production workers, is it sort of Lipset's old school working class authoritarianism, or is it something else? And I think your reply about temporal loss probably answers some of that. But then maybe just as a final question, I had one more point about non-voters, because when you showed us the distribution of where the voters are, you said 35% of the German population is polarized, 15% of Green voters, 20% of AfD voters, but there are also 25% of non-voters in Germany. Where do they fall within sort of the different arenas when you look at sort of polarization? And could they be a reason why parties search for trigger points, that they try to mobilize these voters in one way or another?
This will have to be your last word here. So.
Yeah. I mean, I had a slide with the non-voters. I took it out, but they are standing basically between the CDU and the AfD voters. So they cluster there on migration, on climate, and so. And they might move to the AfD, but they might also be mobilized for the CDU or partly maybe even for the SPD. In terms of the industrial workers, I mean, I agree. They are relatively well-off, well-positioned group. What has changed is, I have no English term for that, soziale Geltung, a kind of public recognition or public standing. So it's not material, it's more a kind of feeling of being appreciated
Status.
status, so in cultural terms. And that has changed quite a lot. And I mean, we have that in many countries. So the dominant groups are the cultural, is the cultural class, dominates the public discourse, dominates. I mean, we have the same in the climate arena. So the middle classes or the cultural middle classes have a very high ecological footprint, but still they behave as they would be ecologically more valuable. Although there's this very strong inequality in terms of consumption, mobility, and so on, but still their lifestyle pretends that they are very good citizens and that they follow, I don't know, the Paris objectives of climate reduction, although the lower classes very often fulfill these objectives already. So they do not have to change anything in their lifestyle. They can go on as it was.
Can you briefly elaborate on solutions? Thank you.
I don't know, I'm a sociologist.
Yeah, well, you've given us a lot to at least, you know, I think certainly to answer that question, we have to do this work first. And so really wonderful, and I think this idea that there are these new cleavages potentially emerging out of this in a way, I think is really a fascinating idea that can perhaps travel outside of Germany. So please join me in thanking you for a wonderful tour de force.